Good morning, everyone. Good morning. And welcome to the Linnean Society of London for our conference today, remembering James Petiver. I'm Richard Coulton. I'm a senior lecturer in the School of English and Drama at Queen Mary, University of London, and along with my colleague Charlie Jarvis from the Natural History Museum, who I can't quite spot, but I'm sure is in here, and many of you know, I've been organising the conference today. I'm just going to say a few words by way of some housekeeping, health and safety announcements, and then I'll introduce the topic of our conference today before handing over to the first pair of proper speakers. So the first thing to say is that there is no planned fire drill in the Linnean Society today. So I've been asked to tell you that if the fire alarm goes off, we treat it seriously, leave the building by the nearest available fire exit in a calm manner, exit onto Piccadilly, turn right, and muster at the entrance to the Burlington Arcade, which is a very fine muster point. Please do muster, because the fire marshals will have a register of your names as people in the building, and they'll have to send the fire brigade in if they don't find you there browsing the first few shops. Secondly, houses of necessity, lavatories, toilets can be found in the basement, down the stairs in this building. That's generally the place that we'll be using, although there are also some toilets in the stairwell above and below the first floor where the library is. There will be refreshments served between each pair of sessions, including lunch at lunchtime. That will be served upstairs in the library. Please help yourself and enjoy what you're served, but don't bring food and drink back into this room. Neither official nor unofficial refreshment should be taken in here. I'd ask you to note that these sessions are being recorded, hopefully for broadcast later on the Linnean Society's YouTube channel. I just mentioned that mainly for the benefit of the speakers who know it already. Audience participation sections will be removed from the recording, so you don't need to worry about that, but any unwarranted intervention, any impromptu stage diving will go viral, so please be warned and avoid that sort of thing. We have a hashtag that any of you who do this kind of thing are very welcome to use for tweeting, hashtag Petiver300. And I also want to draw everyone's attention to a very special guest sitting towards the back in the middle, Elizabeth Stockdale, who joins us today from Scotland. She is the 6 times great niece of James Petiver via his sister Jane. Find her later and ask her about her connections. We're very pleased that you're here, Elizabeth, and hope that we all get a lot out of today and that we can learn from you as well. So finally, before I move on, I just want to say that obviously this event couldn't happen with the amazing support of the Linnean Society. Thank you very much, and especially thank you to Leanne. We've also had support from Queen Mary, University of London, and from the Natural History Museum, which is really fantastic and makes this possible. So the purpose of this conference is to mark the tercentenary of the death of James Petiver in April 1718. And we're going to mark it by subjecting his life and career to some sustained scholarly appreciation and critical reflection over the course of today. Some of you may know differently, but I'm not aware that Petiver has ever been the focus of such a commemoration or meeting before. And so I thought I should offer a few words by way of introduction and justification. James Petiver was at once an exemplary and an extraordinary man of his time. He was born to a prosperous commercial family in Warwickshire during the early 1660s. This was probably in 1663 or 64, although our publicity has followed the ODNB estimate of 1665. Petiver seems to have spent part of his childhood in London, where his father had the freedom of the haberdashers' company. After his father's death, Petiver enjoyed and evidently did value at least a year's education in Rugby Free School, This was at the expense of his maternal grandfather, before he was bound apprentice in 1677 to Charles Feltham, the apothecary to St Bartholomew's Hospital in the City of London. Having seen out his time, Petiver earned the freedom of the Society of the Apothecaries in 1685. And he soon acquired, and over the next 30 years or so, he would maintain a professional apothecary's practice at the sign of the White Cross in Aldersgate Street, which was also his home. Now, Petiver's fortunes fluctuated during those decades. Sometimes he clearly held sufficient wealth to lend three-figure sums to friends and to buy substantial collections of books and scientific specimens. At other times, Petiver endured ill health and debt and near bankruptcy. The main point I'm trying to make then is that while his background was relatively privileged for his time, Petiver was no gentleman of university education or of independent means, but rather he was a professional tradesman throughout his adulthood. He never married, but rather seems to have cherished his bachelorhood, and he had no children. So during the decades to 1695, just beyond his 30th birthday, Petiver developed both intensive interests in natural history, which was perhaps initially stimulated by his apothecarial training, and also an impressive network, personal network among metropolitan natural philosophers. His overriding obsessions would be botany and entomology, although his intellectual passions ranged in many directions. Petiver struck up correspondence with and assisted the research of John Ray, probably the most celebrated English naturalist of the 1680s and 90s. Even more importantly, Petiver became intimate with the physician Hans Sloane. Their relationship would never quite be one of equals, although it was more than that of patron and client. With Sloane's support, Petiver became a Fellow of the Royal Society in 1695, the apothecary to the Charter House in 1700, and demonstrator at the Chelsea Physic Garden around 1705. And in return for this sponsorship, Petiver appears to have integrated his growing international correspondence network with that of Sloane. He passed information and specimens to the physician and managed relations with some of their mutual contacts. When Petiver died, Sloane is supposed to have purchased his collections for £4,000, an awful lot of money. And as a consequence, many of Petiver's papers, books and collections remain today in national repositories around London, albeit that they're typically submerged within other larger deposits. So, James Petiver was a professional man of the middling sort, who made the most of his limited education and income to pursue a love of natural history and to network successfully among its most prominent contemporary practitioners. Over the course of time, this enabled him to build and sustain remarkable collections of both contacts and objects from across the globe. There are well over 100 different letter writers among Petiver's extant manuscripts. They include persons living in North America, the Caribbean, mainland Europe, Southern Africa, South Asia, East Asia, and Indonesia. As a consequence of Petiver's careful admonitory assiduity in maintaining this international correspondence, he acquired myriad botanical, zoological, and mineralogical specimens sent back to him in London, often in the custody of surgeons on merchant ships. These Petiver publicised increasingly from the mid-1690s through papers in the Philosophical Transactions, publications issued at his own expense or via subscription, and by opening his home in Aldersgate Street as a cabinet or museum for select visitors. So Petiver had many friends and even more acquaintances, both in London and beyond. But he was by no means universally liked, much less revered. His personal appearance and background, as well as the condition in which he kept his collections, his dependence on Sloane and his manner of scientific publication, all came under attack during his lifetime. Now, of course, from our own historical perspective, we might judge that some of these criticisms were merited, others less justified. Perhaps most damaging for Petiver's enduring reputation, however, were remarks made by his friend Hans Sloane in the preface to the second volume of his Voyage to Jamaica. This was issued in 1725, almost 2 decades after the first instalment, and of course 7 years after Petiver's death. Noting Petiver's demise and Sloane's subsequent acquisition of Petiver's specimens and papers, Sloane damns with faint praise the substantial extent of Petiver's museum, while excoriating the condition and organisation of his collections. So in this way, in the preface to his own work, Sloane found a means partially to excuse the delayed completion of the voyage to Jamaica. He complains that he was faced with the urgent task of rescuing and recataloguing Petiver's plants, insects, and other objects. Subsequent accounts of Petiver have tended to follow this lead, often characterising him as scatty, disorganised, and unlearned. As a result, Petiver's reputation as a naturalist has arguably been unfairly diminished and occluded. So since the mid-20th century, Petiver has been somewhat rehabilitated by historians of science. Most substantially, Raymond Stearns, following the lead of his doctoral student George Pasty, wrote a substantial biographical appraisal in 1952 that focused on Petiver's American connections. Stearns is complimentary about Petiver. Indeed, he's generous at times. But he does ultimately consider him a dedicated networker who benefited from the scientific labours of others, rather than as an accomplished naturalist or intellect in his own right. To quote Stearns' title, Petiver was a promoter of natural science, a promoter rather than a true practitioner. The more recent material turns in the histories of science and collections might question this distinction, of course, between promoter and practitioner. While attention to Petiver's object collections and accompanying publications, as opposed to the manuscripts which are Stearns' sole focus, this attention might in any case challenge Stearns' conclusion. Nonetheless, his intervention did cast Petiver's life and achievements in a more positive light than Sloane's sketch. And in the last 20 years, a number of scholars have built on Stearns' lead to become increasingly interested in and attentive to Petiver's multi-dimensional archive and legacy. Many of those people are here today as speakers, and as I'm sure they'll demonstrate, these things more than deserve extended treatment in their own right. I'm going to move very shortly into the first main session on the programme. But before handing over to its chair, I want to express my sincere thanks to the 4 highly accomplished scholars who have agreed to give up their time today in order to attend and facilitate the 4 panels. I've decided not to introduce them personally at the start of each pair of papers, mainly because they're already tasked themselves with introducing other speakers, and that would become unhappily recursive, I think. But I will name them now and commend their work to you in the strongest possible terms, and I'm sure many of you will be familiar with one or more of them in any case. The first panel will be chaired by Patrick Wallace, an historian of health, medicine and trade and reader at the London School of Economics. Thank you, Patrick. Second will be led by Miles Ogborn, a professor of historical geography and colleague of mine at Queen Mary, and an expert in both the East Indies and West Indies trades and their technologies during Petiver's period. After lunch, the third session will be chaired by Professor Sachiko Kusukawa, who I've seen but can't have seen again, a fellow in the history and philosophy of science at the University of Cambridge, and Sachiko has published extensively on the visual dimensions of early modern science. The final panel then will be facilitated by Professor Arthur McGregor, known I'm sure to many of you as President of the Society for the History of Natural History, words I always stumble over, and a preeminent historian of scientific collections. So to each of you, again, many thanks for being here with us. So finally, just some practical notes about the organisation of our sessions. We have 4 panels, each of them about 70 minutes in length. In general, in each case, we're going to hear from the 2 presenters consecutively over the course of 50 or 55 minutes, and then hopefully have around 15 minutes for questions and discussion afterwards. Then at the end of the day, we'll hear from a 5th distinguished guest, Emma Sperry, who I'll introduce later, and who will offer her concluding reflections as part of a period of further discussion. But now I'm going to hand over to Patrick Wallace, who will introduce the first pair of our speakers.